unfortunately, with today's operating systems, and particularly given the fact that a lot of countries are still using a lot of Windows XP, it's not that hard to get into somebody else's computer.
That was Dr. Martin Libicki, and his story will be coming up later in the program. You're listening to Asia News Weekly, a digest of some of the biggest stories from the Asia-Pacific region. You can download all of our shows via iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. And if you enjoy this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Updates on Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. The UN tells Japan comfort women were sex slaves. And will South Korea get cozy with China? These stories and more are on the July 25th edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome everyone to Asia News Weekly. I'm your host, Steve Miller. First up this week is an update on Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. Joining me now via mobile phone from Tokyo is Ricardo Ochoa.
After days of laying on a field and being held by pro-Russian separatist rebels, the bodies of the victims from Malaysia Flight 17 finally began their journey back home. A train carrying more than 280 victims arrived in the government-controlled city of Kharkiv on Tuesday, approximately 300 kilometers from the original site. Forensic experts and government representatives from the Netherlands, Australia, the UK, and other countries with citizens on board when the flight was downed by a surface-to-air missile last week on Thursday by Russian-backed rebels were present when the bodies were to be transported. Ukraine officials say that nearly all 298 victims from Flight 17 were on board the train. The bodies are to be flown on a Dutch military jet. Their remains are to be taken to the Netherlands or their respective countries for forensic analysis. For Asia News Weekly, this is Ricardo Ochoa.
World leaders are still calling for an unimpeded investigation into the incident so that those responsible can be brought to justice. According to a Pentagon briefing, after the plane went down, Russia continued to move artillery into the area, heightening tensions. That development leads many to question whether or not Russia had some involvement in the incident. There have also been allegations of tampering with the plane's black box. Malaysia Airlines has also set up a special family support center hotline, but they declined to comment on air on what exactly support is being provided to families. In other unfortunate aviation news, Wednesday, Taiwan's Trans-Asia Airways flight GE222 crashed at Magong on the Penghu island chain. The turboprop plane had been flying from the southwestern city of Kaohsiung to the islands off the west coast and had been previously delayed by Typhoon Matmo. 48 individuals lost their lives and 10 others remained injured. As more information develops on these two stories, please follow our Facebook and Twitter streams for updates. In just a few minutes, Seoul and Tokyo resume talks over victims of sexual slavery. Indonesians went to the polls on July 9th to elect a new president. Despite Joko Widodo's lack of political experience, he built a reputation as being a man of the people and an efficient leader. He championed democratic reforms and was elected Jakarta's mayor in 2012. He was widely viewed as untainted by the often corrupt military and business elite that had run Indonesia for decades. His opponent was Prabowo Subianto, who came from a wealthy and well-known family. Subianto had several human rights violations on his record stemming from his military career, but was often seen as a strong and decisive leader. He also received endorsements from most of the country's major political parties. The quick counts that followed the elections picked Widodo as the winner with less than a 1% margin of error. Throughout the official tallying phase, both Widodo and Subianto accused the other of fraud and vote tampering. 1 hour before the official results were made public on July 22nd, Subianto quit the race, saying, quote, "The process of election carried out by the Election Commission, the KPU, is flawed, not democratic. And the KPU, as the executor, is not fair and open. We will use our constitutional rights to reject this election and pull out from the ongoing process." End quote. In the official election results, the commission announced that Widodo had beaten Prabowo Subianto by more than 6 percentage points. Current President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono urged Subianto to concede, noting it was noble. Subianto has announced that he will contest the election's result in constitutional court, saying Widodo's campaign took part in vote buying and accused the Election Commission of not fulfilling its investigatory duties. Widodo will be sworn into office this October, barring any problems. If you would like to learn more about this or any of the stories mentioned in this week's episode, visit the show notes at asiannewsweekly.net. Don't forget you can also connect with us via social media. On Facebook, you can find us at facebook.com/AsiaNewsWeekly and at AsiaNewsWeekly on Twitter. South Korea and Japan are set to resume their monthly discussions on wartime use of women for sex. However, the United Nations has recently sent Japan a directive that may make things a little bit more difficult. Joining me to discuss the topic in Seoul is journalist Eugene Huang and co-host of the Cafe Seoul podcast. Eugene, what happened?
Okay, so next week, Japan and Korea will meet to discuss the World War II sex slavery issue, and the United Nations has asked Japan to use the phrase enforced sex slaves instead of comfort women.
Now, this is something that the United Nations has been doing for some years in reference to these women, correct?
I believe so, yes. And also, I remember that Hillary Clinton a few years back on a high-profile interview said something similar to, let's be clear about what these actually are. These are not comfort women, they're sex slaves. So I think this is a good decision, mainly because, the word comfort woman, it doesn't really have that much of a negative connotation. I mean, a woman that gives you comfort, that could be talking about my mother. When I was a kid, my mother certainly gave me lots of comfort. So I think it's best that they use an exact phrase like enforced sex slaves because the nuance is clear. These women were duped or coerced into servicing the soldiers sexually, and they are also considered slaves because they were either paid very low wages or not paid at all, or they couldn't just up and leave at their own volition.
Do you think this will have any bearing on the meetings? I've long said that these meetings aren't going to be fruitful in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, well, about the meetings themselves, I would have to agree with you. I don't really think that nothing very much could happen because of these meetings. It just seems like they're going through the motions.
Right. And do you think this has any political benefit for either side?
Well, absolutely. Basically, in Japan, the way the government is set up, people who live in the rural areas actually have more of a say on how the country is governed than people who live in the cities. And that is actually a minority of the population. So it's if you want to hold power in Japan, what you have to do is pander to the people who live in the rural areas, which tend to be more conservative and possibly older. So a good way to, get the political support from these people is to present Japan in all its glory as a strong, world-leading country, and do something like calling people comfort women rather than sex slaves, or, talk about the issue of Takeshima or Tokto, and then get people's nationalistic sentiments riled up.
Correct. Correct. But even in Japan's response to the United Nations, they were still very adamant in saying that these were not sex slaves, that these were prostitutes, that there was no direct military involvement, or at least that point was still being debated.
Well, yeah, but I think that in itself, that response is very hypocritical because, since 1956, Japan has said that, prostitution itself is illegal. And in that specific law, they say, there's certain parts of the law that discuss pimping or finding women to be prostitutes, saying that that's like an abominable crime and things like that. So if you're going to pass a law like that, then you should try to correct your own past instances of the same thing. And even if we give Japan the benefit of the doubt, which I'm not doing, but if we were to do that and say that, okay, yes, they were just prostitutes, but you made a law that says prostitution was illegal, then they should do something to at least correct that past evil, shouldn't they?
On the Japanese side, that they would, as they often have, come back and said the 1965 bilateral agreement, made a formal apology and paid reparations in full at that time.
Yes, that's true. The only thing I would say about that is they were negotiating with a military dictator, and I don't think that they were, adamant enough to say that we'll give this compensation to you, but you've got to use it in the correct way. I mean, it was just like, okay, here's the money, we paid you off, you can't really talk about it anymore because the issue is solved because we gave you money. And that's not really a responsible way to negotiate for something that you genuinely feel sorry about,
I would agree with that. And then also on the Korean side, the courts have said that the Korean government at the time didn't have the right to negotiate a settlement on behalf of those being harmed.
Well, I don't know if I totally agree with that. A lot of times when you talk about certain problems and social issues in Korea, or certain laws or certain things that the government did in the past, the knee-jerk response is, well, we were ruled by a dictatorship at the time, so you can't blame us for that, And there is a little bit of grain of truth to that. So yes, I think that, yes, the government at the time can't really adequately represent those people in a democratic way, but at the same time, that response itself is kind of, I don't think that's really fair. We weren't a democracy yet. That's something you hear a lot whenever you're critical of Korea in some way.
And Korea itself really isn't, I guess, innocent in this matter as well, since they've also now been faced with a lawsuit by several other quote-unquote domestic comfort women.
Yes, during the Korean War and shortly after it, the Korean government kind of sponsored a similar program for its own soldiers and also U.S. soldiers who were occupying Korea. I've heard many different tellings of this tale. Some people say it was because they wanted lots of cash from a foreign source, and so they sacrificed these women so they could get it. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but at the same time, there's also people that say that it was just a similar system where they would, go find young ladies and trick them into work. Why don't you come with us and work in a factory and make money to support your family? And then suddenly they're in this position where they have to give sexual favors to people they don't know or else, and they can't escape it. So I think something that's really important in this case, if Korea wants to point the finger at other countries and say, look what you did to us, but it is not, doing right for its own people, then that's very counterproductive. It should get its own house in order first and provide an example of what needs to be done. And then, talk to other countries and say, well, this is what we have done to correct our own problems. Maybe you could try to do something similar.
And you bring up a really good point. When the court said that the previous administration didn't have the rights to negotiate on behalf of the citizens for reparations, it specifically pointed out the arbitration clause in the 1965 agreement, which has led to these meetings. Do you think ultimately that there will be any kind of further reparations, or will Japan simply stand by the 1965 agreement?
I think as far as reparations go, the remaining known survivors or surviving women who were sexual slaves at that time they're getting old, and eventually, probably within the next 10 or 15 years, there won't be any of them left. And then at that point, who would you give the compensation to? That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, I feel that having lived in Japan and having, lots of deep relationships with Japanese people, as time goes on and the current elite or the current generation that is in power steps down for one reason or another, either by passing away or retiring or whatever you want to say, the new generation of people that are maybe in their 30s or 40s now will assume power positions. And generally, from what I've seen from Japanese people, they generally do want to have good relations with the rest of Asia. So there will be somewhat of a shift, I think, a generational shift, and then they will start to make amends, probably within the next 20 or 30 years. But as far as giving actual money to actual people, I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's not really what the whole thing has ever been about. The whole issue has been about, at least for some of these women, from what they say, is that they want Japan to acknowledge actually what they did and then take steps to correct it and educate the people about it. And I think we're almost at the point where that will happen because of this generational shift, although I could be wrong.
All right, thank you very much, Eugene.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
That again was Eugene Huang, and you can find his Twitter ID as well as a link to the Cafe Soul podcast in the show notes. A few more pieces of information related to this story. The United Nations Human Rights Committee said Tokyo still lacks an apologetic tone towards the women forced to be prostitutes for the Imperial Japanese Army. The Japanese delegates then argued that the phrase enforced sex slaves was not an appropriate term. Takeo Kawamura, an 8-term lawmaker with the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, said during a Heritage Foundation discussion in Washington, quote, "Can we do more? It's not that we haven't found it yet, but I think we can, and please understand that we will deal with it. It's not over yet." End quote. Well, where do you see these discussions going? Will this directive kill talks between South Korea and Japan? Will it also force Seoul to own up to its own history? Please share your thoughts in the comments on Facebook and Twitter. Coming up in just a few minutes, will South Korea become closer with China? In Thailand, junta leader General Prayut Chan-o-cha secured royal approval for an interim constitution. It was an expected development. Quote, "His Majesty the King will grant an audience to General Prayut and will endorse the interim constitution," said a senior official at the Bureau of the Royal Household. This provisional charter secures General Prayut's role and allows him and the National Council for Peace and Order, the NCPO, to suppress any action both inside and outside the kingdom that could possibly be considered a threat to national peace, security, economy, or the monarchy. There are 48 separate articles in the charter, the last of which gives amnesty for all those involved with the May coup d'etat. Reuters quoted a junta colleague saying, "Thai General Prayut Chan-o-cha has run the country flawlessly since he seized power in a military coup in May, and would make a good prime minister under a provisional administration to be set up shortly." Both the National Legislative Assembly and the National Reform Council will be selected by the NCPO and ratified by His Majesty. The National Legislative Assembly would then nominate 35 individuals for the cabinet to be then appointed by His Majesty. The Constitution Committee will have 36 members. They'll be appointed by the National Reform Council. The chair will be named by the NCPO. The remainder of the committee will have 20 members put forward by the National Reform Council, 5 from the National Legislative Assembly, 5 from the Cabinet, and 5 from the NCPO. Ambika Ahuja, a specialist on Thailand from Eurasia Group, a New York-based political risk consultancy, believed Prayut would retain control of the government either as Prime Minister or as Defense Minister. Ambika added the charter gives the army effective control of Thailand's constitutional and electoral reform. But even as things move forward, martial law remains in effect. General Prayut Chan-o-cha has solidified himself as the architect of the new Thai government. The international community, now more than ever, will scrutinize his actions and decisions to see if he is a man of his word, and the overthrow of the government was for the benefit of the Thai people. Coming your way every Monday and Wednesday from Asia News Weekly is Asia Now. It's a podcast that features stories and conversations taking place in Asia now. South Korea and China have agreed to launch a military hotline between the two governments by the end of this year. It's the second such country for South Korea, which currently operates a direct line with the United States. Seoul has desired this level of connection since 2007, but it wasn't granted until Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent visit to Seoul. The primary goal of the line is to ensure regional stability, especially as North Korea continues to act out in attempts to garner attention. While military confrontation on the peninsula remains a threat, albeit a very remote one, of greater concern is North Korea's continued assault on South Korean computer networks. Martin Libicki, a senior management scientist at the Rand Corporation, recently said in an interview, quote, "I think North Korea's cyber aggression even exceeds mutual Israeli-Iranian aggression. The attack on South Korean banks that wiped out desktop computers did not arise from the usual cybercrimes motives, taking money, but from spite and vandalism. The lesson is that cybersecurity cannot be understood out of its context. In South Korea, it's less of how good cybersecurity is, and more how good it is relative to the threat from the North. Given the disparity of cyber warriors between North and South Korea, I asked Dr. Libicki to clarify the relative threat."
For South Korea, it's sort of good news and bad news. The good news is that North Koreans are not as competent as the Russians or the Chinese. The bad news is that they're considerably nastier. I'll give you an example. For about 15 years, people have known that if you can put malware into a machine, you can probably, I would say destroy it. It's more technical to say brick it, turn it into a brick, where you'd have to reboot the machine and you lose all the information in the machine. And people worried about it for a long time. The problem for that worry was that for the most part, hackers weren't interested in turning your machine into a brick because they had much better things to do. In March 2013, North Korean attackers went after South Korean banks and I think media companies, and they ended up turning these computers into bricks, which was not to their benefit directly. I mean, they didn't get any money out of it. They didn't get any intellectual property out of it. But it was harmful to the South Koreans, the people they attacked.
Yonhap News reported that North Korea has, about 5,000 or 6,000 cyber experts. South Korea is now trying to increase its number of cyber experts and is now saying that they're going to pilot mandatory computer programming in their educational programs. Is it just a numbers game, as in who has more attackers or defenders?
It doesn't really work that way, okay? First of all, this is one of those fields where you have to look at their offense versus your defense. And at the same time, if you want to be symmetric about it, you have to look at their offense versus North Korea's defense, okay? North Korea has one enormous advantage in this game. They're not really connected to the rest of the world very much. It wasn't that long ago that they weren't connected at all. So you could have all the hackers you want, but if you had no way of getting inside North Korea, there wasn't very much for them to do, okay? So most of the action is going to be North Korean attackers and South Korean defenders. South Korea, for instance, at one time, and perhaps still does, has the most broadband per person. It's a very wired country, right? And there are a lot of things that are dependent on this. North Korea is probably at the other end of the scale. So, now let's go with a number which sounds roughly right, that they have 5,000 to 6,000 hackers in North Korea. Now, then what you want to look at is the number of people who are doing defending in South Korea. And my hunch is that if they look anything like the rest of the world, we're talking tens of thousands of people. But it's not really a numbers game, because it depends on not only the numbers you have, but your degree of isolation, how diligent you are in terms of keeping your computers up to date, what kind of software you run, how accessible you've made your systems to the rest of the world.
There was a report last year that it was, I guess, thrown around that some North Korean hackers would try to create either mobile or other distributed video game with some malware in it to hopefully infect some South Korean computers to turn them either into zombie devices or other agents that could, launch a denial of service attack. Has any more come out about that, or is that just one report from last year?
I think I read the article about the same time you did. I mean, unfortunately, with today's operating systems, and particularly given the fact that a lot of countries are still using a lot of Windows XP, it's not that hard to get into somebody else's computer. In fact, the most common method now, I don't know if it's the most common method, but it is a very common method, is to go to a popular website and figure out how to infect one of the advertisements on the popular website.
It was an absolute pleasure speaking with Dr. Libicki. In an article, he also mentioned the best leverage that South Korea might offer would have to work through China, convincing China that the risks of a North Korean collapse are tolerable compared to all other risks that might exist from not tamping down on North Korea. Senior defense analyst at the Rand Corporation, Bruce Bennett, expanded on Dr. Libicki's comment via email. First, we don't know exactly how the North Korean cyber threat is organized, but the media indicates that there appears to be a group of North Korean hackers based in China, and that other North Korean hackers appear to operate through Chinese internet sites. Therefore, South Korea could potentially reduce the North Korean cyber threat by trying to shut down North Korea's cyber operations from Chinese territory and/or from Chinese network sites. China has sufficient cyber expertise to be able to do this if it chooses to. It's simply a matter of choice, and one that China is more likely to make if South Korea, versus the United States, asks it to do so. Second, it is true that China's #1 regional objective appears to be maintaining peace and stability in Northeast Asia, including avoiding the collapse of the North Korean government. But shutting down parts of the North Korean cyber threats would be unlikely to cause the North Korean government to collapse. But in practice, South Korea is more likely to push for a North Korean collapse if North Korea continues its provocations against the South. China has been very vocal about its interest in regional peace and stability, but China has largely chosen to avoid criticizing North Korea for its serious provocations and violations of UN Security Council resolutions. I believe that a world with serious North Korean hacker attacks on South Korea is less likely to create an environment of peace and stability than if that hacker threat is significantly reduced, so China would actually achieve its ultimate objective better by significantly reducing the North Korean hacker threat. I'd like to thank Dr. Libicki and Dr. Bennett for their time in contributing to this report. Most experts believe China is the key to regional stability, and South Korea's line to Beijing could certainly improve things on the peninsula. But how will it play out regionally, as most countries have a negative view of China in light of its recent expansion? Please leave your thoughts in the comments on our Facebook page or Twitter. Well, my friends, those are all the stories for this week's show, but let's hear what you had to say from last week. From Yukon Goldie, I believe the main reason China's government has lured South Korea's government into a stronger economic partnership is mainly for military purposes. South Korea, with its economical and military strength, will give China a more geographical strategic position in Asia, and eventually will incorporate South Korea's military. I believe it is just a matter of time before there are actual violent conflicts in the region, with South Korea backing China. Aaliyah responded to our disability in Japan story. Oddly enough, I have a completely different experience in Osaka, with people getting up out of priority seats. I am a woman, and there are times when I have to wear knee and ankle braces because of a collagen disorder that leaves my ligaments too loose, from Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I could be wearing braces on both knees and be visibly limping, and will have people in the priority seats pointedly ignore me. I don't think I've ever been offered a seat, even though I have made people move. It makes me wonder if it's less of a foreigner versus Japanese thing, and this person is American, and more of a male versus female thing. Chris Guerra had this to say about our Curtis Chin interview. While the Meiji and Taisho emperors of Japan became inebriated with modernity and wanted to assert the dominant role that eventually led Japan to a path of conquest and expansion, China tried unskillfully to stay afloat in the hands of the corrupt and inept Qing rulers. The decline of China meant the rise of Japan until its defeat in 1945. Contrary to what Mr. Chin states, both countries are in a collision course due to present similarities, rather than a change of temporal roles. In present days, China and Japan are re-emerging from a long period of dormancy, and in the process reclaiming all the influence and position once had, the former in a millennial scale and the latter one in a decade scale, both colliding in present day. And finally, this is Liz thanked me for announcing the MH17 disaster calmly and professionally, without wasting time making up possibilities. Thank you again for leaving your comments on our podcast. It means so much to me, and I really do value them. I also want to take a moment to thank you for listening to the podcast this and every week, as well as subscribing and sharing the podcast on Twitter, on Facebook, and your other social media accounts. It really helps us to produce a great show and for it to grow. You can find this podcast as well as Asia Now on Stitcher, iTunes, and TuneIn Radio. And you also have the option of subscribing only to Asia News Weekly, only to Asia Now, or the unified feed with everything in it. If you have any feedback about the show, what you like, what you don't, please email me. The email address is podcast@asianewsweekly.net. That is it for this week's show. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. For Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.